Hi, my name is Paul Duchesne. Welcome to Mama Paul's Video Podcast. Today is Saturday, March the 27th, 2021. I'm going to get started with a few different updates about what happened for the last couple of weeks here. I'm going to talk about the few mass shootings we've had, too big to fail, the good news and bad news from Rachel, the Republican Party, and if we have time, we'll get into a few of the magazines that are currently floating around on your magazine racks. So, just to get started, what a week for shootings. Holy Kazinko. It's been, what, 2.5 weeks now? We've had three mass shootings. There were two up till last night, and then late, as I was getting ready to go to bed last night, a third shooting in Virginia gets mentioned. So the first shooting was the real one it was the Asian women. And this was at the end of a period, or an ongoing period, of anti-Asian violence in America. Now, whether the shooter was going after Asian women or sex workers is not really clear, and I wouldn't want to jump to a conclusion based upon where we're at today, other than the fact that we know that he has a dislike for Asian women. We know that he's a sex addict, and his excuse was his sex addiction was just a bit too much for him. Well, this got really picked up the next day by the Christian far-right Christians. I don't know how they even have the name Christian tagged onto themselves, these people. These are the Guns for Jesus group. And they're talking about the problem that men have with sex and how it's all in our mind here and how we can't control it. And the women, it's because they all look so good and everything. So this story was sort of making these BS excuses for, the testosterone is flooding men so badly that they can't control themselves. And these women are just so gorgeous looking. Well, how could they? So I guess the only conclusion is maybe the far-right Christians maybe want to cover the women up in burqas or something. Maybe we could put them in a nun's habit. The far-right Christians and the far-right Islamic extremists are getting so close to each other, they're going to wind up getting in bed together. Both of these groups are into violence. Both of these groups are against women, and both of these groups are very sectarian about their own, who isn't the good guy. The other in both cases becomes somebody that should be eliminated with guns. This is really absolutely disgusting. And it's been 21 years since Columbine. 21 years since Columbine, when the first mass shooting of this kind of level happened. There has not been one piece of federal legislation in 21 years. Not one piece of federal legislation. Nothing for a background check to eliminate these high-capacity magazines. Nothing to stop somebody from walking into a gun store or at one of these flea markets where they sell them and walking out with a gun that day. Doesn't matter whether he's got restraining orders against him or whether he's a complete crazy, walks in, he's got the money, he can get a gun. I mean, you can't get a driver's license without going through a hell of a lot more hoops than you go through to get a gun, that's for sure. This is absolutely insane. You can't make it up. And people sitting there wondering why we have so many problems like this. The guns that are out there aren't necessarily the main cause for all of the mass shootings. Guns are also used in suicides, which are one of the biggest reasons how guns are used to kill people at home. So the actual fact of having the gun makes it easier for somebody to pick up a gun and shoot their brains out, or go in and shoot somebody else's brains out. So America, love it or leave it, right? Yeah, sure. Okay. Too big to fail. What was that about? Okay, too big to fail. I got to show you the little book here. I've had this for quite a while. This guy writes pretty regularly in, you find him in the New York Times regularly. The Curse of Bigness, his name is Tim Wu. And the subtitle on the book is Antitrust in the New Gilded Age. He's got quite a few books out, and he's a Columbia Law School contributing writer, New York Times. I find him in other magazines also. He talks about the curse of bigness, and basically he's warning about bigness and how the bigness leads to bigger problems. It's not necessarily great that things get bigger. Too big to fail was your classic from 20 years ago, the statement, the banks are too big to fail. We need to prop them up. Well, that's not really the case. They should have failed. What's propping them up is government interference is what's propping them up. They fail because of their capitalism and the way they run the business. As a private sector company, they wind up failing. Then the government comes in and bails them out. Then as soon as the government comes in and bails them out, they step back and go, oh, get the government away from us. We need to run this on our own principles here. This is what happens right and left every time it happens. Using the rules of the game that they're playing with, they run the business into the ground. They need to get a bailout. They get a bailout from the government, and as soon as they get the government bailout, they push the government back away and say, oh, let's us run it the way we normally run things so we can run it back into the ground again and you can save us again. Can you imagine if this happened with you as an individual who maybe spent too much money and the government just came in and, oh, you're spending too much here, have some more money there and spend some more. I don't think so. So anyway, the too big to fail, the metaphor for me, the fact that the book for me was a metaphor for what happened this week with the well, there it is, the ship that got stuck in the Panama Canal this week. Now, not the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal. So this ship is as it's as long as the Empire State Building is tall, literally the same length as the Empire State Building is tall. That's how big the ship is. And that little picture there, you see that little that little crane there trying to move some dirt and push things away. I mean, it looks like an ant up against an elephant, which is about what it is. Well, the ship is going through the Suez Canal when these strong winds come along and blow it. So the winds blow the ship on this angle, and then it gets wedged in between the two sides. And there was shallow water in that section, so it's grounded into sand. And it's been over 3 days now, and they can't seem to get it moving. They're talking about now taking some of the 20,000 containers on the ship, I think. I don't know how they would do it over there, but so this has caused an international problem now in the supply chain for all these containers that were going from China to mostly to Europe, and then there's stuff coming from Europe going in the other direction, and ships are already backing out a little bit and trying to go down around the Horn, around Africa, and the other routes. And really interesting, this was really interesting, because of the attention that was paid to these ships that were en route. This particular ship is called the Ever Given. Well, there's another ship called the Evergreen, which is involved with the illegal transport of oil products from Saudi Arabia and around that area to China. And if it wasn't for the Suez Canal incident happening this week, this would have just slid under the radar. But because of it, there was this close scrutiny. And in today's New York Times, right through about the middle of the front section, the whole big two-page or full-page article about how this ship has slipped under the radar, how a ship called the Evergreen goes and fuels the ship that's going to then go to North Korea. So they're not supposed to be sending oil to North Korea. They are. There's money in it. They're going to do it. So anyway, that was it. The too big to fail aspects of it. The banks were too big to fail. The social networks are too big to fail. The fast food restaurants are too big to fail. They're all too big to fail. And it really hit home this week. Richard Wolff on his show, Economic Update, talked about too big. I had been talking about the disparity between the wages of the lower paid workers and the CEOs and CFOs of these companies. And in one of my last shows on the Powell Memo, I mentioned a 350 to 500 degree difference between that medium wage of the low end and the high end. Well, it turns out McDonald's has 1,000 times higher this chief executive officer is making than the medium wage. The medium wage is the average between the lowest and the highest of the workers who are the hourly workers, not the salaried people, the hourly workers. So the medium wage of the hourly workers times 100 is what the chief executive officer is making at McDonald's. If this isn't complete lunacy, I don't know what is. It's just out there. What can you say? Okay, let's get that down. And Rachel Maddow the other night. It's been quite a week for news about voting and democracy in general. So last night she opened up her show with a whole rap about what's going on in Georgia with the suppression of the voting rights. Did about a 10-minute piece on that. She then finished by going into a positive piece of news that had to do with Virginia and the state of Virginia, which used to be the most pro-execution capital punishment state in the nation. It was the most pro-capital punishment state, executing more people than anybody else. And 20 years ago or so, if you said they're going to change, Virginia's going to become against the death penalty, nobody would have taken you seriously. Well, just the other day, it finally happened, and Virginia became the first state, or one of the early states, to completely ban the death penalty. What a remarkable change in attitude. The Democratic governor, I believe, a couple of the Democratic legislatures here and there, and people that weren't completely driven by ideological insanity or Trump gangsterism wound up voting for these changes in the legislature in Virginia, and there won't be any more executions in Virginia. So that was like a huge positive piece of news against the negative news about what's going on with the elections. And the biggest voter suppression bills probably in the history since Jim Crow back in the 60s and before has just passed in one day. It was written, went through the legislature, and went into and was signed by the governor within one day. If the state makes it really difficult to vote, so you wind up on a line outside for a long time because there isn't enough facilities for you, which is what they've been doing. If somebody came along to give you a glass of water because you were on line for too long, or you were an old person that was getting weak and fainting, you could be charged with a felony for giving somebody water on the line. The extent to which they put these voter suppression laws in is just absolutely mind-blowing. Forget about the drop boxes and the cutting back in the hours and the cutting back in the days. Everything that was done to help bring out voting is being suppressed by the Republican Party. The Republican Party, the organizing principle of the whole party is becoming voter suppression. Georgia is the main place where they just went and passed it. They've got laws like this going in legislatures and Republican-controlled legislatures in about a dozen states. One of the attorneys in Arizona at one point said that, well, we're going to lose elections if we can't fix the voting, we're going to wind up losing elections. And the judge went along with the guy's argument. I mean, this makes no sense at all. So we got this Republican Party who, instead of going back to some original principles about governing, about finance, about anything, they're going with the Trump white supremacist, fascist, totalitarian playbook. They're not compromising. They're not negotiating. They're not being reasonable. They're being hard-headed on this party line that's right in line with Donald Trump. We thought we got rid of him. Maybe, I don't know what happened to him, but we definitely have not gotten rid of this guy. His footprint is all over this country right now. And in line with that, the whole Stop the Steal BS, Dominion, I think it's Dominion. Dominion, there's two companies that were making these voter equipment. One of them was Systematic and one of them was Dominion. And they both they were both badmouthed all over Fox News, all during this period in September, October, through the election, that they were stealing votes, doing all sorts of illegal things, the companies were no good. Well, the companies got so badmouthed by Fox News and Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, that real fast-talking, Sidney Powell was that fast-talking woman that one of the last people that Trump was able to get as a intelligent-sounding person on his side. Her and Giuliani were sort of on a little road show doing this whole Stop the Steal. Well, between those two and a bunch of hosts on Fox News, these two companies are suing Fox, Smartmatic for $2.7 billion and Dominion for $1.6 billion. They're suing them. That they've destroyed their reputation and they're hurting their company, and they want jury trials. In both cases, they want to have a jury trial, which is really interesting. They're not just going to sit down and roll over for these people. Well, those were the main things that were sort of on my desk here. I wanted to bring you over to look at a couple of magazines that have been floating around. The New Republic and Harper's, Yes Magazine, New Yorker Magazine over there, and a couple of books I've been looking at also. And the one book here, let's hold that up. Let me talk about this book for a minute. This is called Headed into the Abyss, and the author is Brian Watson. And I found the book in the New York Review of Books about a week or two ago, so I ordered this. And it's the story of our time and the future we'll face. Now, Brian has been a reporter and a journalist for about 20-odd years, and he wrote for a small newspaper in, I think, in Salem, Massachusetts. And he reads widely and ferociously in books, magazines, newspapers. He speaks to people. He writes on all sorts of different topics, including genetic engineering, the internet, the environment, psychiatry, drug addiction, gambling. He's trying to bring things to people's attention, and he saw a tremendous contradiction and poor choices within nearly every aspect of the society, and especially in our relationship to the ecosystem. So he says, I was on a mission, and I was fortunate enough to be able to devote full time for the past 15 or 16 years. My mission was to understand what was and is going on and to write honestly and clearly about it. Well, I could really identify with this guy, except for the fact that I'm not fortunate enough to devote my full time to this, and I've got to have a day job, so I'm only able to do this kind of stuff part-time, but I dabble in the type of thing this guy is writing about. Now, at the back of the book here, there's the front of the whole book there, Brian. The back cover, there's 10 areas that he identifies as where the problems are. In the current state of just 10 forces, there's 10 forces within our society: capitalism, the technology, the internet, politics, the media, education, human nature. Boy, there's a big one. Human nature, the environment, population, and transportation. He said these are driving society in predominantly negative ways. These forces are powerful and interconnected, and their combined operation and dynamics will carry us into any number of disasters well before the end of this century. We have the knowledge and solutions to address our difficulties, but for many reasons we won't be able to meaningfully employ either. So although we know what to do and how to do it, we more than likely won't do anything about it. And I can really relate to that. It seems like that's the case. It seems like that's the case. One other statement he makes: we face many threats, but one of them, the internet and its algorithms, is changing everything about our world and our very capacity to recognize how dangerous the change is. So the algorithms that are built into these websites, where most people are getting their news and their information from, these algorithms are basically downplaying the severity of the climate crisis we're in, the disparity in wages that we're in, the technological problems that we have, the hacking into the whole system from people around the world. So Headed into the Abyss was, not a well, it is a real page turner. It's not a real upper. I have my own little answer for what's going to happen, but before I mention that, there were two other books, and this was an older book, Dark Ages Ahead, and this was Jane Jacobs, the gal who wrote Cities and the Wealth of Nations, one of my main heroes from the 20th century, Jane Jacobs. She wrote this book quite a while ago, back in 2004, okay, 16 years ago, and she's outlined the political and economic factors that were in a state of decline and were similar to what was happening during the period of the Dark Ages that preceded the Dark Ages. So she's a real heavy thinker. She's done a lot to talk about the positive sides of capitalism, and she's mainly a city planner who was responsible for stopping across a thruway in Manhattan, which led to Soho becoming Soho, and she was also the major person responsible for these farmers markets in America. She promoted this type of thing of getting neighborhoods together with these farmers. Before we had national farmers markets, she was the one. I think she went up to Boston, the Boston market, and some in New York. So she's heavily influential there. The other one I'll mention is my favorite political economy guy, Robert Heilbronner, wrote The Worldly Philosophers, which, if you're interested in political economy, this is the life and times of the great economic thinkers. So Adam Smith, Karl Marx is in here, John Maynard Keynes, Henry George, and it's not just their concepts economically, it's a little bit about their life. It's a real easy read. If you have any interest in political economy and you want a book that describes the people behind the theories and the theories, this was one of the most well-read books in the 20th century in political economy. The biggest bestseller up till the time probably when Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century came out. The book that Heilbronner wrote, which was the predictor of where we're at today, was The Human Prospect. The Human Prospect. Now he started to write this in the late 70s, recognizing the impact of the environmental changes that were happening. He was on top of this right from the very beginning. And he updated the book looking at the 90s, and parts of this book were excerpted and published by Adbusters magazine. So Robert Heilbronner could talk about Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx, smoothly, and not be a Marxist, but talk about Marx. So he's a really interesting writer, but he was seeing the flaws in the system and how they were not being addressed. And he did a rewrite of his earlier work in the 90s, which is very prescient to where we're at today. So those are things if you had an interest in wondering how we got to where we're at. There's a good lead into how we got to where we're at. Let me go over here for a minute. What do we got? 23 minutes. I'll go for a couple of minutes. The New Republic over here, and they had a couple of really interesting articles. The subtitle here, the article's message was simple: everything must change. And they're quoting here, this was a week before the inauguration of Biden. Conservation Science magazine had an eye-catching title: Underestimating the Challenges of Avoiding a Ghastly Future. And it sounds like a science fiction movie that they're talking about here, but the next page, the subtitle is: the article's message was simple: everything must change. The climate crisis, an existential threat to planetary life. And from a capitalist point of view, this article is trying to say, how do we sell Wall Street on the idea of how do we create growth opportunities for Wall Street money to support the new green movement. They went on to talk about the triple crisis that capitalism is facing, and the deficits of economic justice and democratic participation, the acute deficit of economic justice, we don't have economic justice, and democratic participation. Democratic participation, we had a little bit of it in Georgia. A little bit of it pushed Biden over. Now it's being attacked ferociously. Capitalism is facing three major crises, and they've got to do with the health crisis, talking about the pandemic and how we addressed it and how unprepared we were for it, the climate crisis, and the economic crisis. And this is an amazing statement here. The financial sector has to a large extent been financing itself rather than the real economy. The financial sector, maybe pop it there for a second. The financial sector has to a large extent been financing itself rather than the larger economy. All during last year, the Fed was pumping money in to these large corporations basically two ways. They were lending money, they were giving money to banks, which were then lending it to the corporations, or they were giving money directly. In both cases, they were creating a circular flow of money, which was propping up the value of these stocks, which is where we're at today. Which is why some people are looking at it going, wow, this market is really, really overinflated. I mean, what are we going to do about this? Then this is the New Republic, and there's an article about oil. The history of oil is the history of imperialism. And then the big one I thought was the, I'll put this over here, was the Bannon article. And there's Steve Bannon, a little caricature of Steve Bannon. And it's Steve Bannon and the fourth turning of the Republican Party. So it's a whole big article here explaining how he basically, he's destroying the Republican Party as we know it. Trump and his all allies are totally taking over this party and just ripping it to shreds. I think we're going to leave it there. One quote I wanted to finish up with. So I've been talking a little bit about what was going on with the Republican Party, and the back end of this story over here was, I had it up here before. You might notice. This was Biden's press conference the other night. And in his press conference the other night, Biden seemed to be arguing to prove anew to a skeptical world that both American democracy and its model of democratic capitalism still works, and that it's superior to the very different systems that Xi Jinping and Putin are trying to exert on the world. So he's basically making an argument for democracy as opposed to authoritarianism. When I did the Powell memo for the last 5 weeks here, I was talking about free market capitalism and the free market system in a democratic free market system. I've been talking about the system and how the system has been perverted by the Powell memo over the years, and the corporations have just gotten more and more powerful. It's created an imbalance which has got us where we're at today. So progressive and leftists typically have been very critical of the system. Myself, I've been very critical of the system. But it's one thing to criticize the system, and it's another thing to blow it up entirely. So we're not looking to blow it up entirely, and heading into the abyss. He's not opposed to capitalism at all. He thinks it's it's going to save us. He feels like, but it needs to be regulated. It needs to be regulated. There was a statement on Bill Maher's show last night. Bill Maher, Catelyn Flanagan, who's a staff writer for the Atlantic magazine, said, "Hating America is not a luxury we can afford." I'm going to end it with that. Hating America is not a luxury we can afford. So we on the left have been very critical of the system for a long. There's a lot to be critical of. You can criticize it all day and all night. And there's a lot of greed, there's a lot of outright corruption throughout it, and that has been the problem. But when you come along, you try to address the corruption within the system, you wind up getting labeled as somebody who hates the system. And that's not necessarily what's going on. So she's saying, Kathleen Flanagan is saying, hating America is not a luxury we can afford right now. The authoritarians, the white supremacist, fascist authoritarians, are taking over the Republican Party. They practically put a stop to most of the congressional activities. And unless we, whoever we are, get together and do something about it, it's game over. Peace, patience, persistence. We'll see it as soon as we can. And remember, hating America is not a luxury any of us can afford.